I am 26 years old, and yesterday was undeniably the hardest day of my entire life because I had to say goodbye to my father after his short but brutal battle with an aggressive illness. I never imagined that I would be dealing with legal threats and eviction notices before the flowers on his grave had even started to wilt. But my stepmother apparently decided that grief was a luxury I simply couldn't afford. My father married Elena 5 years ago, and while I never fully trusted her, I tolerated her presence for his sake because she seemed to make him happy during his final years. I always suspected she was significantly more interested in his financial stability and his portfolio than his actual well-being, but I kept my mouth shut and played the part of the supportive stepson to keep the peace in our family. That fragile peace shattered completely the moment we returned to the main house after the memorial service, right after the last guest had finally driven away, and the house fell into a heavy silence. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at a photo of my dad on the mantel, when Elena walked in with a terrifyingly cold expression that I had never seen on her face before. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries or shared mourning. Instead, she informed me that I needed to pack my things and leave the guest cottage on the property by the end of the week. I looked at her in total confusion because my father had explicitly told me that the cottage was mine and that the main house would eventually be split between us. She reached into her purse and pulled out a document that she claimed was a newer, handwritten will that my father had signed just 3 weeks before he passed away, supposedly superseding everything else he had ever filed with his lawyers. She told me that in this new version, my father had realized I was young and capable of working, so he left the entire estate, including the house, the cottage, and his savings solely to her to ensure she was taken care of. I felt the blood drain from my face as I tried to process the betrayal, but my gut was screaming that something was wrong because my father was a meticulous man who didn't believe in handwritten legal documents. She smirked at me and explained that if I tried to fight it in court, she would drain the estate dry with legal fees until there was nothing left for either of us, so I should just cut my losses and leave. My heart was racing with a mix of sorrow and rage as she turned around and walked into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine, acting as if she hadn't just destroyed my life. I sat there paralyzed, wondering how I was going to survive without the home my father promised me, until I remembered a very specific, strange conversation I had with my dad in the hospital, just 2 days before he went into a coma. He had grabbed my hand with surprising strength and whispered something about a safety deposit box and a failsafe that I had dismissed as a hallucination from the morphine at the time. I realized with a sudden jolt of adrenaline that my father might have known exactly who he was married to, and he might have prepared for this exact moment. I stood up quietly, grabbed my car keys, and decided that I wasn't going to pack a single box until I found out what was inside that safety deposit box he mentioned. I had no idea that opening it would reveal secrets about Elena that were far darker than just greed. I drove to the bank with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, constantly checking my rearview mirror as if Elena might be chasing me down the highway to stop me from uncovering the truth. I knew the bank would be closing soon, and I had to get there before the weekend lockout, or I would spend the next 2 days wondering if I was actually homeless while she consolidated her power back at the house. I remembered that I still had my father's heavy keyring in my pocket, the one the nurse had handed me at the hospital, and I prayed that the small brass key I had seen on it 1,000 times was actually for the box he whispered about. When I finally got into the vault, the air felt cold and stale, a stark contrast to the summer heat outside, and the silence pressed down on me just like the silence in the house had earlier. I fumbled with the lock for a moment before the box slid out, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted the lid to see what my father had considered important enough to hide from his wife. Inside, there wasn't a mountain of cash or gold bars, but rather a single thick manila envelope sealed with tape and a date written on it from just 2 months ago. I sat on the floor of the bank vault and tore open the envelope, my hands trembling so bad I almost ripped the papers inside. The first thing I pulled out was a letter addressed to me, written in my father's familiar, jagged handwriting, and reading it felt like hearing his voice one last time. He wrote that he loved me, and that he was sorry for not being honest sooner, but he had started to suspect that Elena wasn't the woman he thought he married. He described how she had become increasingly aggressive about his finances as his health declined, constantly asking him to sign papers when he was groggy from medication or in pain. He explained that he had played along to keep her calm because he was too weak to fight her physically or emotionally, but he had secretly met with his lawyer to create a masterful estate plan that she knew nothing about. The letter stated clearly that any new will produced after a certain date was likely coerced and should be immediately contested using the evidence he had enclosed in the folder. I dug deeper into the envelope and found a USB drive and a stack of printed emails that seemed to be between Elena and a man I had never heard of. I started reading the top email, and my stomach dropped because it wasn't just about cheating. They were discussing timelines for my father's death and how to liquidate his assets quickly before I could intervene. I sat there realizing that my stepmother wasn't just greedy. She had been actively planning this takeover for months, waiting for my father to die so she could erase me from the picture. I knew I had the ammunition to stop her eviction, but then I saw a sticky note attached to the USB drive with a warning that chilled me to the bone. It said that if I was reading this, I needed to be extremely careful because Elena had connections that could make life dangerous for me if I confronted her directly without backup. I was about to pack up and leave when my phone buzzed in my pocket with a text message from Elena asking where I was, and the tone of the message made me realize she already knew I wasn't in my room packing boxes. I stared at the text message from Elena for a long time, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized she was either tracking my movements or just intuitively knew I was up to something that could ruin her plans. I decided to lie through my teeth and texted back that I was just at a hardware store picking up heavy-duty boxes and tape to start packing up the cottage, hoping that sounding defeated and obedient would buy me enough time to figure out my next move. I shoved the documents and the USB drive deep into my jacket pocket and walked out of the bank, trying to look casual, even though I felt like I was carrying a bomb that could go off at any second. I knew I couldn't go back to the property yet, and I certainly couldn't go to my own apartment in the cottage because she likely had a spare key. So I drove to a crowded coffee shop on the other side of town where I knew the noise and chaos would give me some anonymity. I found a corner table away from the windows, opened my laptop, and plugged in the USB drive with hands that were sweating so much I had to wipe them on my jeans first. The drive was organized into folders labeled with dates, and most of them contained audio files which suggested my father had been paranoid enough to hide voice recorders around the house during the last few months of his life. I put my headphones in and clicked on the most recent file, dated just a week before he was admitted to the hospital for the last time, and listening to his weak, raspy voice arguing with Elena was almost too painful to bear. But the conversation quickly shifted from a domestic argument to something much more sinister when Elena's voice turned icy and she mentioned that she was tired of waiting for nature to take its course and that she needed the assets liquid before the end of the fiscal year. I sat there frozen in the coffee shop, realizing she wasn't just waiting for him to die. She was actively stressing him out and possibly tampering with his care to speed up the process. Then another voice entered the recording, a man's voice that was smooth, confident, and terrifyingly familiar. He was reassuring Elena that the new will was drafted perfectly and that the original copy in the lawyer's office would be misplaced conveniently when the time came. It took me a few seconds to place the voice, but when I did, the realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut, because it wasn't a random lover or a shady stranger. It was the family attorney, my father's oldest friend, and the man I was planning to call first thing in the morning to help me fight the eviction. I slammed the laptop shut, feeling the room spin as I realized the entire legal safety net I thought I had was actually a trap set by the two people closest to my father. I was sitting there hyperventilating, trying to figure out who I could possibly trust, when I looked up and glanced out the window toward the parking lot. My heart stopped because I saw a silver sedan idling 2 rows back, the exact same make and model the lawyer drove, and as I watched in horror, the driver's side door opened and he stepped out, looking directly at the front entrance of the coffee shop. I didn't wait to see if the lawyer actually spotted me. I slammed my laptop shut, shoved everything into my backpack, and bolted toward the back of the coffee shop where the restrooms were located. I noticed an employees-only door that was slightly ajar, and without a second thought, I slipped through it, past a confused barista, and out into the alleyway behind the building. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I sprinted around the block to where my car was parked, praying that he hadn't blocked me in or brought backup. I managed to jump into the driver's seat and peel out of the parking lot, just as I saw the lawyer walking through the front glass doors of the shop, scanning the tables with a predatory look that made my skin crawl. As I merged onto the highway, driving aimlessly just to put distance between us, the reality of my situation crashed down on me. They knew where I was. It suddenly clicked that Elena had gifted me my current smartphone for Christmas last year, insisting it was a generous upgrade. But now I realized it was likely how they were tracking my every move in real time. I pulled over at a gas station, bought a cheap burner phone with cash, and threw my actual phone into the bed of a passing pickup truck to lead them on a wild goose chase in the opposite direction. I felt a strange mix of liberation and terror as I drove to a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, a place so seedy that I knew neither Elena nor the high-powered family attorney would ever think to look for me there. Once I was safely locked inside the room with the chain on the door, I spread the contents of the manila envelope onto the stained bedspread to find out what my father's next instruction was. I found a smaller sealed envelope at the bottom of the stack labeled "The Nuclear Option," and inside was a business card for a woman named Sarah, along with a letter explaining that she was a forensic accountant and private investigator my father had hired a year ago. The letter detailed that Sarah had been building a case against Elena and the lawyer for months, documenting every penny they had siphoned from his accounts and every unauthorized change they made to his estate planning. My father wrote that Sarah held the only copy of the actual finalized will, which contained a specific poison pill clause designed to destroy them if they ever tried to cut me out. I grabbed the burner phone and dialed the number on the card, my breath hitching as it rang, terrified that she might be part of the conspiracy too, or that the number would be disconnected. But after 2 rings, a woman answered, and she didn't say hello or ask who was calling. She simply said my name in a calm, authoritative voice and told me that she had been waiting for my call because her system just alerted her that the safety deposit box had been opened. She told me not to speak, but to listen very carefully because we had a very small window of opportunity to act. She explained that Elena had already filed the fraudulent handwritten will with the probate court that morning, which meant they were moving faster than my father had anticipated. Then she dropped a bombshell that made me realize this wasn't just about money anymore. She told me that according to her surveillance, Elena wasn't at the main house tonight. She was currently meeting the lawyer at my dad's private warehouse, a place where he kept his vintage car collection, and apparently something else they were desperate to destroy before I could find it. I drove toward the warehouse district like a maniac, running 2 red lights, because the thought of them destroying the last pieces of my father's history made my blood boil hotter than fear ever could. Sarah had told me strictly to wait for her to arrive with the police before making a move, insisting that we needed them to be caught in the act for the charges to stick, but every mile I drove felt like a countdown to something irreversible. When I parked my car a block away and sprinted toward the corrugated metal building, I saw the flickering light of flashlights cutting through the dirty windows, confirming that the nightmare was unfolding exactly as Sarah had predicted. I knew I couldn't use the main entrance, so I scrambled up a stack of old shipping pallets around the back to reach a small ventilation window my dad had left unlatched for years to let the fumes out when he was working on engines. I managed to squeeze through and drop down onto the mezzanine level, landing silently in the darkness above the main floor, where my father's prized collection of vintage cars was stored. The smell of gasoline hit me instantly, thick and suffocating, overpowering the usual sense of oil and old leather that I had grown up loving. I peered over the railing and saw Elena and the lawyer standing next to my father's 1967 Mustang, a car he and I had spent 3 summers restoring bolt by bolt. They weren't just looking through the car, they were destroying it. I watched in horror as the lawyer used a crowbar to pry open the custom dashboard we had installed, ripping out the leather and smashing the wood trim while Elena stood by holding a red jerry can. They weren't looking for a document. They were looking for a specific hidden compartment that my father had built to transport cash for his business deals back in the 80s, a secret he had only ever shared with me during a late night in the garage. My heart stopped when the lawyer finally wrenched a metal panel loose and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger that I instantly recognized. It wasn't the will. It was my father's black book, a detailed log of every bribe, handshake deal, and off-the-books transaction he had made over 40 years. But more importantly, it contained the collateral he held against his business partners, including the lawyer. I realized then that this wasn't just about inheritance theft. The lawyer was helping Elena because my father had evidence that could send him to prison for life, and they needed to burn it all to be free. I pulled out my burner phone to record them, my hand shaking violently as I zoomed in on the lawyer flipping through the pages with a look of pure relief on his face. Elena said something to him, gesturing around the room, and he nodded, tossing the ledger onto the driver's seat of the Mustang before grabbing the jerry can from her hands. I watched, paralyzed, as he began splashing gasoline not just on the car, but in a trail leading toward the stacks of oil drums against the wall, clearly intending to blow the entire warehouse sky high to cover their tracks. I knew I had to wait for Sarah, but when the lawyer pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and flicked it open, the flame illuminating his smiling face, instinct took over logic. I couldn't let them burn my father's legacy, and I certainly couldn't let them destroy the only proof of their corruption. I looked around desperately for a weapon and saw a heavy wrench sitting on a shelf right next to me, and without thinking about the consequences, I grabbed it and prepared to jump. But just as I shifted my weight, my foot knocked against an empty paint can in the darkness, and the metal clattering against the concrete floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent warehouse. Both Elena and the lawyer whipped their heads up toward the darkness where I was hiding, and the lawyer didn't hesitate for a second. He raised his arm and threw the lit lighter directly onto the gasoline-soaked upholstery of the Mustang. The car erupted into a fireball instantly, the heat blasting my face, and I realized I was now trapped in a burning building with two people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The heat in the warehouse went from uncomfortable to incinerating in a matter of seconds, the fire climbing the walls and licking at the wooden support beams of the mezzanine where I was crouching. I watched through the thick black smoke as the lawyer didn't even bother to look for me. Instead, he turned toward the exit, clutching his briefcase to his chest. And then he did something that shocked me even more than the arson itself. Elena screamed his name, realizing that the fire had spread faster than they anticipated and was now blocking her path to the main door. But the lawyer simply glanced back at her with a look of pure indifference, stepped out the side exit, and slammed the heavy metal door shut, leaving her trapped inside with me and the inferno. I realized in that moment that he hadn't just planned to destroy the evidence. He had planned to tie up all his loose ends, and that included the greedy widow who knew too much. Elena was coughing violently, backing away from the burning Mustang, her eyes wide with terror as she realized she was going to die in the trap she had helped set. I knew I could have stayed safely on the upper level near the vent and climbed back out the way I came, leaving her to the fate she arguably deserved. But my father's voice was in my head, and I knew he wouldn't have wanted me to become a murderer by omission. I took a deep breath of the smoky air, grabbed the heavy wrench I had found earlier, and vaulted over the railing, landing hard on the concrete floor about 10 feet away from where she was cowering. She looked at me like I was a ghost, paralyzed by fear, but I didn't waste time with explanations. I grabbed her by the arm and dragged her toward the back of the workshop, where I knew my dad kept the emergency welding equipment. The fire was roaring like a jet engine now, consuming the oil drums and sending plumes of toxic black smoke rolling over us, making it nearly impossible to see where we were going. I found the heavy fire-resistant welding blanket my dad used to protect the cars, threw it over both of our heads, and shoved Elena toward the old loading bay doors that had been rusted shut for a decade. I slammed the wrench against the locking mechanism with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I had, screaming in frustration as the metal groaned but refused to budge. Behind us, the tires on the Mustang exploded from the heat, the sound deafening us and sending a wave of shrapnel pinging off the metal walls. And I knew we had seconds left before the gas tanks in the other cars caught fire and turned the warehouse into a bomb. With one final desperate swing, the lock shattered, and I threw my shoulder against the corrugated metal, tumbling us both out onto the cool gravel driveway, just as a massive concussive blast shook the ground behind us. We scrambled away on our hands and knees, gasping for clean air, as the windows of the warehouse blew out and flames shot into the night sky, turning the building into a towering torch. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the smoke, realizing that the ledger, the car, and everything my father had built was currently turning into ash, meaning the lawyer had won. He had destroyed the proof. But then I heard a sound that changed everything. Not the sirens approaching in the distance, but a low, hysterical laughter coming from beside me. I looked over at Elena, her face smeared with soot and tears, sitting on the gravel and laughing like she had lost her mind. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice raspy from the smoke, and told me that the lawyer was an idiot for thinking the physical ledger was the only leverage she had kept. She tapped her temple and whispered that she had taken photos of every single page of that black book months ago as an insurance policy, and since the lawyer had just tried to burn her alive, she was ready to give me the password to the cloud account where they were hidden. By the time Sarah skidded into the warehouse lot, her car tires kicking up gravel, the building was a lost cause, a roaring skeleton of steel and fire against the night sky. I sat on the bumper of an ambulance while paramedics checked my lungs for smoke inhalation, watching Elena frantically talking to a police officer a few yards away. She was playing the part of the traumatized widow to perfection, crying on cue and pointing a shaking finger toward the road where the lawyer had fled, conveniently leaving out the part where she had been his accomplice right up until he decided she was disposable. Sarah walked over to me with a grim look of satisfaction and told me that her team had intercepted the lawyer on the highway less than 10 miles away. Apparently, speeding away from a massive explosion in a luxury sedan tends to attract attention. She said he was currently in custody, and with the footage from the warehouse cameras she had hacked into earlier, plus the testimony I was about to give, he wasn't going to be practicing law or seeing daylight for a very long time. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders, but then I looked over at Elena and felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach because I knew the battle wasn't over yet. When the police finally finished with us, Elena walked over to where I was sitting, wiping the soot from her face with a tissue, and her demeanor shifted instantly from hysterical victim to calculating survivor. She looked at me and said that since we had worked together to take down the lawyer, she assumed we could come to a civil agreement regarding the estate without dragging things through the courts. She actually had the nerve to suggest that since she provided the digital evidence that would nail the lawyer, she deserved to keep the main house while I could keep the cottage and a small stipend, framing it as a generous offer given the circumstances. I was too exhausted to scream at her, but Sarah stepped in between us like a shield, her expression stone cold. She told Elena that there would be no deals and no negotiations because the handwritten will she had filed was now evidence of fraud, which meant the estate reverted to the previous legal document my father had signed years ago. Elena smirked, crossing her arms, and said that even under the old will, she was entitled to a significant portion of the assets as the surviving spouse, and there was nothing we could do to strip her of her marital rights. Sarah didn't argue. She simply reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick, blue-bound document that looked distinct from all the other paperwork we had seen so far. She told Elena that my father had indeed anticipated that she might try to play the grieving widow card while hiding her true nature, so he had added a very specific, watertight codicil to his will just 2 days before he lost the ability to speak. Sarah explained that this document was the failsafe my father had whispered to me about, and it contained a clause known as a conditional bequest. The color drained from Elena's face as Sarah opened the document to the very last page, where my father's shaky signature was notarized and witnessed by 2 doctors and Sarah herself. Sarah looked Elena dead in the eye and said that my father had left her a choice in this clause. She could either walk away with a modest one-time cash settlement that would require her to leave the state immediately, or she could claim her full inheritance. Elena's greed took over instantly. She laughed nervously and said obviously she wanted the full inheritance, calling the settlement offer an insult. Sarah smiled, a terrifyingly sharp smile, and said she was hoping Elena would choose that option. She turned the page and began to read the conditions of the full inheritance aloud, and as I listened to the words my father had written from his deathbed, I realized he had orchestrated the most beautiful, devastating trap I had ever heard of, one that didn't just take her money, but was about to take her freedom. Sarah read the clause with a calm, devastating precision that made the crackling of the dying fire behind us seem to fade into silence. She explained that my father had added a no-contest provision with a twist. He had secretly installed pinhole cameras in his bedroom and studied 3 months before he died, capturing hundreds of hours of footage. The codicil stated that if Elena accepted the settlement of $50,000 and waived all future claims to the estate, the hard drives containing that footage would be destroyed. However, if she attempted to claim the full inheritance or fight the will in any way, the drives would be immediately turned over to the district attorney as evidence of spousal abuse, medical tampering, and attempted homicide. I watched the color drain out of Elena's face until she looked like a corpse, her earlier confidence evaporating into thin air. She knew exactly what was on those tapes. She knew they would show her switching his medications, ignoring his calls for help, and verbally tormenting him when he was too weak to respond. My father hadn't just protected his money. He had weaponized his own suffering to ensure that I wouldn't have to spend the next decade fighting her in court or wondering if she had killed him. He had handed her a choice between a life of poverty or a life behind bars, and he knew exactly which one a coward like her would choose. She didn't scream, and she didn't try to negotiate anymore because she realized that Sarah wasn't just a lawyer, but the executor of a vengeance plan that had been perfectly calculated. Elena's hands were shaking violently as she asked for a pen, and right there on the hood of a police cruiser, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights, she signed the settlement papers and the waiver. She didn't look at me as she finished. She simply grabbed the copy of the check Sarah handed her, turned around, and walked away into the darkness toward the main road, a defeated figure disappearing from my life forever. The next few weeks were a blur of police statements, insurance adjusters, and funerals, not just for my father, but for the life I thought I was going to have. The lawyer was denied bail, thanks to the digital evidence Elena had provided, and the testimony I gave regarding the arson. It turned out he had been embezzling from multiple clients, and my father was just the first one to catch him. The warehouse was a total loss, and with it went the cars that held so many of my childhood memories. But strangely, I didn't feel the crushing sense of loss I expected. When the estate finally settled, I learned that my father had moved the bulk of his liquid assets into a trust for me long before the Black Book drama even started, ensuring that I was taken care of regardless of what happened to the physical property. I used a portion of the money to rebuild the cottage, not as a guest house, but as my permanent home, and I planted a new garden over the spot where the warehouse used to stand. It felt right to replace the scene of so much destruction and greed with something living and quiet. Yesterday, I finally received the package Sarah had promised me, the only thing salvaged from the safety deposit box that wasn't legal paperwork. It was a small flash drive containing a video message my father had recorded the day he signed the final codicil. I sat on my porch and watched it, crying for the first time since the funeral, as he looked into the camera and told me that he wasn't afraid of dying, but he was terrified of leaving me alone with the wolves. He said he hoped I never had to use the nuclear option, but if I was watching this, it meant I had survived the fire and come out the other side free. I'm 26 years old, and I'm starting over with a clean slate, no family secrets, and no enemies left to fight. My stepmother is gone, living in obscurity somewhere with her blood money, and the man who tried to burn my history is rotting in a cell. It cost me my childhood home and the cars we built together, but my father taught me one last lesson from beyond the grave. Things can always be replaced, but freedom and peace of mind are the only inheritances actually worth fighting for.